Hello and welcome to the Jumpstart Podcast with Jeffalytics. I'm your host, Jeff Sauer. Today for our 63rd episode, I wanted to give you an insider perspective on our process for hiring an apprentice, which has been happening here at Jeffalytics over the past few months. I also want to give you some general insider information on what a hiring manager or a business owner goes through when they're hiring for digital marketing positions. Now, I've written about my hiring process several times before, and I'll link to those in the show notes, but this is the first time I'm actually going to talk about this on the podcast. This is going to be a free-flowing type episode where I only go through the top 10 bullet list points, and I don't have a lot of notes within, so we'll see where this leads. The truth is that I'm recording this episode rather last minute because I spent last week on a road trip throughout Portugal, seeing this wonderful country. We made it south to a small island on the Algarve. We made it east to Spain, which happened by accident, and then north to the Vinho Verde country. We went through the harsh drought conditions and 100-plus degree weather, that's Fahrenheit, smelled the salt water in the sand of Faroe Island, and even managed to stay in an ancient tower perched above a vineyard in Vinho Verde. And I did it all while only managing to open up my laptop for maybe 15 minutes total. It was equal parts disconnecting and poor internet, with the only connection coming from a tethered 2G network on my US phone. Now, I'm not going to lie, it was nice to disconnect, and it was nice to have our interview with Sujan Patel locked and loaded well before I even headed out on this trip. 3 cheers for our organization process, which I've talked about several times on this podcast. But the organization is not perfect. As I mentioned, this is a last-minute recording, so let's make it count. Here are 10 things that I've learned from hiring over the years, plus an inside look at how this applied to our apprenticeship process. Number 1, applying is the easy part. It is really easy to apply for positions. It's really easy to fill out forms. It's really easy to submit a resume. Yes, I know people stress over their resume. They spend a lot of time on it, but on the internet, it's really easy to get an application in. Basically, there's some kind of form, some kind of questions you fill out, and you apply, and that's it. It's really easy to do, and anybody can do it. So it's basically just table stakes. It doesn't really mean much. It's not really meaningful to do the application itself. Now, this is a hard one for some people who have applied for jobs and not heard back and had trouble because they think that, all the effort goes into putting in the application. And I might annoy some of you even by saying that you're doing the easy part, you're doing the easiest thing, but that's just what it comes down to, is that you're just a number at that point. Basically, sending out an application is just a number. There's no obligation for the employer to really do much. They are sifting through a lot of stuff. So at best, just by submitting the application, all the employer owes you is a response that maybe you weren't taken to the next step. And that might sound harsh, like I said, but that's sort of how I look at it. So applying is super easy. That's just table stakes. That's just like breathing at this point. So how do you get beyond that? Let's go to the next step. Number 2, know your numbers. So this is from a hiring manager perspective. Know your numbers. Treat hiring like a funnel. Treat it like something where like conversion rate optimization or any other type of marketing process. So if you have 100 people who apply for a job, what percentage of them do you want to actually have an interview with? Which percentage of them do you want to work with moving forward? And how many positions are you hiring for? So if you have 100 people coming into your process and you need to hire one person, you're not going to interview all 100 people, right? You're going to do whatever you can to eliminate it. You're going to get it down to a reasonable number of people you want to talk to. You're probably going to want to get it down to like 5 people at most that you talk to, maybe 10, but not more than that because you only have so much time. So understanding what you want to get to and knowing your numbers helps you make decisions. If you want to hire one person and you get 2 applications, then you're going to have to give them all interviews or you're going to have to increase your reach. And so I like to say my sweet spot in general for number of applications, somewhere in the 50 to 100 range of people who come in, and then people that I interview 5, and then getting down to maybe your 2 final candidates and then having them go through the ringer or through the process. That's just my general thing around numbers, but treat it like a conversion optimization funnel. And if you're the one who's applying for a job, think about it from that perspective too. How do you get beyond that process? How do you get beyond being just a number? How do you get beyond being one of 100 resumes sitting in a pile? Number 3, understand supply and demand. So this sort of piggybacks on knowing your numbers. If you get 100 applications coming in and they're all of pretty high quality, then you have a good problem as a hiring manager. You get to choose between good candidates. If you put yourself out there and you get 2 people applying, then you're going to have another problem, and that is you don't have enough demand to really get the best candidates. So understanding how supply and demand factors into everything helps you see whether you're going to have to make a tough decision, which is having too many good people to choose from, or whether you're going to have to make another tough decision, which is choosing from 2 people who are not in your ideal zone. So understand how that works, and then understand the dynamic of how many applications you have and how that affects your decision-making process. The more you have, the more you can be selective. And I'll tell you a little bit about that with my existing process in just a second. But let's get to number 4. Take time to be clear in your job description and your hiring process. So before you even accept a single resume, make sure that you're very clear with what you want somebody to do and what the hiring process is. Because that way they know what they're getting into, and there's no wrong or misset expectations. So for example, I wrote a huge description on my website about what I want in an apprentice. It was actually, you basically had to read for 5 to 10 minutes in order to even see the application form. And I wanted everybody to go through it. One of the things I made people do is listen to a podcast, like a 30-minute podcast episode, in order to hear what I'm looking for as well. So basically, in order to even get to the application form, or in order for your application form to actually pass the first round, you had to have listened to a podcast, read 5 to 10 minutes. So I basically required 30 plus minutes of somebody's time before they could even see the application form. Or if they didn't listen to that podcast and then they submitted the application form, their response would pretty much get them rejected, because I weighted a lot of points to somebody listening to that process. Now, the reason why I did that is because I knew, I don't have analytics open in front of me, but I knew that I'd get hundreds to thousands of people to look at that form and express some sort of interest. I put it out there, and I knew that there was going to be a lot of interest, so I wanted to make sure that people were very clear on what I wanted them to do. And I didn't get a bunch of junk applications or people who thought this was a good idea, but were just applying to throw their name in the hat. So the more barrier of entry I put in process, the more I was clear with what I want, the higher the quality of submissions were. And that ended up being the case. Of the submissions that came in, very few people were actually rejected. And I think a large number of people went to the form, but only the ones who were serious filled it out. So I put a barrier in place, and I was very clear with what I wanted. And that made everything else down the line much easier. At the same time, those who did submit, I was very clear with them as to what the next step was in the hiring process as well. So if you submitted, after putting that 30 to 40 minutes or an hour of your time into the application process, if you did that, then everybody got a response. You deserved a response at that point. And I basically said, here's the next step. I'm going to have you do an assignment. And that assignment was basically a very difficult assignment. It was probably asking for another 5 to 10 hours of work from the candidate in order to take it to the next step. And as you can imagine, with each of these big barriers that I put in place, it started to weed out the people who were sort of tire kickers or not very interested in something or not very serious about it. And they sort of self-identified as like, I'm not going to go through this much work for something that's not guaranteed. And so we basically eliminated, probably from visitor to form being filled out. Like I said, I don't have analytics open in front of me, but at least 90% of people who visited just left because they didn't want to put in the work to even submit the application. Because as I said, applying is the easy part. So if they leave before the easy part, great. Because I didn't want somebody who thinks that 1 hour of time for the opportunity of what I consider to be their lifetime. That might be a little bit conceited to say that the apprenticeship is the opportunity of their lifetime, but it's a big opportunity. I don't think it was worth either of our time for them to take that effort if they didn't want to put an hour into it. And the next group, if you didn't want to put 5 hours into it, then it's probably not worth your time either. So basically, we had steps that eliminated people through the process, but we were very clear about what our process was. Number 5, everybody deserves a response. And so, like I said, we had a certain number of people fill out the form that, spending the hour listening to the podcast, going through that process. And every one of those people got a response, even if it wasn't, very few people were actually rejected based on how they filled out the form, because it's like the form was the form. But those who were automatically rejected got a rejection notice. Those who basically filled out their form, they were given an assignment to know what their next step was. And about 75% of people who were given the assignment, actually a little bit more than that, dropped out. They didn't want to put the 5 to 10 hours into it. And I respect them for that, because this wasn't the right opportunity. But also, It made my decision much easier because 75% of the people who thought that they were interested in it didn't want to put in 5 to 10 hours. Now, you might think about that 5 to 10 hours in your career and where you're at, and you might think, wow, that's asking a lot. It is. But the reality is that it's a good opportunity, and the opportunity goes beyond a short-term inconvenience. Like, think about how little time that really is in life. I gave people 2 weeks to complete the assignment, and all I asked for was basically 30 minutes a day for a week, or 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks. That's not that much time. You could do it. There's so many ways you can do that, right? So yes, it was asking a lot, but that's the process. Now, this bullet point is everybody deserves a response, right? Basically, I gave everybody a response that I feel is commensurate with how much time they put into the process. I tried to, at least. So if they filled out the form and they did the process of creating a video, doing all the different work, the 5 to 10 hours of work, then I created a video for them to explain where we were at. If they went through the interview process with me, then I gave them even more time. So I tried to give somebody an equal amount of time to how much time they gave me. Now, it's not one-to-one by any means. I didn't spend 5 to 10 hours responding to somebody, but I gave them a higher quality response because they gave me more of their time. And I tried to turn it into a mentorship process for those who didn't make it to the next step and tell them where we were at. And I did my best. None of this stuff's perfect, but that's what I tried to do, because I truly believe that everybody deserves a response. I personally have applied to jobs in the past. I haven't applied to a job in 15 years, but when I applied to jobs when I was getting started, if I didn't even get a response, that pissed me off so bad. I decided I'm never going to knowingly not give somebody a response. If they put in the time, they deserve a response. And that's sort of my process that I go through. Now, if anybody's ever applied to something and I didn't give them a response, please do share and I will give you a response. But I try not to let that happen. I try to let process govern the way that these things go. Anyways, moving on. Number 6, add a barrier of entry using real world conditions. So let's talk about that. So I mentioned barrier of entry a lot. I mentioned that I'm asking somebody to do an assignment. I'm asking for a lot of their time. Here's a few other ways that I controlled the number of applicants, because like I said, everybody wants this opportunity, but only so many people will put in the work or that they want to get there. So I added an application deadline where you had basically 2 weeks from when I announced it to when the application would go or would be closed. So you had 2 weeks, and if you discovered it at the end of the second week, then you had, basically 3 days to submit the application, and that was a hard deadline. In addition to that, once we got all the applications in, people had exactly 2 weeks to complete an assignment, and the assignment was a 4-step assignment. And if you're curious as to what the assignment was, I'll give you a gist. It was to write a blog post based on a topic. It was around analytics. It was to critique one of the landing pages of something that already exists in the Jeffalytics universe. It was to create 3 Facebook ads to different segments that we wanted to market to, using your own creativity. And then the final one was to revamp an email sequence for somebody who had downloaded the periodic table of Google Analytics. And you're probably hearing that and you're like, man, that's a lot of work. It is. And the responses were tremendous, though. And so that's how we got people to weed themselves out, basically by adding a barrier of entry. You need to do these things. This is a copywriting apprentice we were hiring for. So if you're a writer, you shouldn't have much trouble writing. But some people just didn't want to write. They didn't want to do these things. But that was an example of a real world condition that you'd work under. In fact, most people wouldn't have 2 weeks to complete the assignment. They'd have less time. So if you're going to be a writer and you're going to be doing this every day for me, yes, I feel justified in making you complete the assignment in a certain amount of time. So I think it was the right choice to make. And like I said, it did weed out the people who were like, this sounds cool. I definitely want to learn from an internet marketing person. I want to learn. I want to do all these things. But if they can't put in the work then, they're never going to put in the work once they get the gig. Does that make sense? I only have so much time in the world. I can't try to prod somebody to write. I need a writer. And there's people who are willing to do it. And it all comes back to the numbers game, right? If I had 2 people apply to this thing, then that means that I did it wrong. I didn't get enough exposure. I didn't do all the things that I should have been doing. So I had the luxury of knowing my numbers, and I could do that. Moving on to number 7. Time is a precious resource. Let's never forget that. I only have so much time in the day. You only have so much time in the day. So basically, I could have done like the humanitarian thing, the nice thing, and basically put out that every single person who submitted an application would get me on the phone, get me into a video call, and we would talk. And that would have been a full-time job for about 2 weeks. And I would have hated every minute of it because some of these people didn't deserve my time necessarily. And I shouldn't say that. Everybody deserves time, but because of the amount of effort they put in, if they spent an hour applying for something, they don't get an hour of my time back. Like my time, frankly, is very valuable. I can charge clients a significant amount of money for that time. And so just because you put in an hour doing an application doesn't mean that you get an hour of my time. And so I had to whittle it down, and I had to basically say, okay, well, 1 hour of my time is equivalent to probably being you putting the 5 to 10 hours into the assignment. And that's sort of how the time stacked up in this place. Time is a precious resource, especially on my end. So I basically made it so that it was more manageable. And I think that proved to be the right decision in this case. Number 8, everybody's on their best behavior during the interview process. Now, this is something that goes all the way back to my hiring days for the last 10 plus years, is that everybody, when they go into an interview, they're selling themselves. They're making themselves sound like the greatest person in the world. And it's easy for that to happen, for somebody to be like, man, I'm so excited about this. It's going to be so great. And it's easy for somebody to get charmed by the performance art of interviewing. It's easy to emphasize somebody's soft skills because they seem nice, they seem eager. There's this notorious person who I hired who went into the interview saying, yes, I want to learn everything. I'm so excited about this. And then they didn't do any work at all after we hired them. And because of this situation, we ended up implementing this thing where, yes, we will not get charmed by interviews. We're going to put somebody to the test. We're going to give them an assignment, and we're going to see how they do in that assignment. And we're going to be able to take both their personality or their soft skills, along with their hard skills, their ability to actually do the work, and to do the work during a certain deadline. And then we're going to weigh those together, plus other factors that go into how we decided things for our business. And we're going to use that to make our decision. So we actually discount the interview quite a bit, other than just saying, is this a person that we would want to work with? Is this a person we could end up working with? And so I think it's a combination of the work you do and the interview. And so in this case, I had them do the work first, and then I did the interview. Back at my previous position where I was in charge of hiring several positions in digital marketing, back then I did it the opposite way. So I'd actually have all these interviews, and then I'd do the assignment for the last 2. So I just flipped it around a little bit, and actually that saved me quite a bit of time doing it this way, based on the number of applications I had. So I would say have them do the assignment, and then the assignment grants them the interview, because I knew my numbers and I was in a position where that was possible. Again, every situation is different, and I have the fortunate luxury of having been able to send out the application for the apprentice to my list of 15,000 plus people that are in digital marketing. So I was able to sift through the applications a little bit easier than maybe somebody else would have been if they were in a different situation. Number 9, decisions are difficult, but they're necessary, right? You have to decide. So if you're going to put yourself out there and say, I want to hire one person to do this job, no matter how good, if you have 7 good people, which in my case, I was sorting through 7 good people, you have to decide who's the one. And it's not just deciding who's the one, you have to commit. You have to basically say, one is better than the other ones, or one is more along the lines, or you have to clarify with all these people to say who's the best one. Who's the one that we want to take to the next level? Who's there? And it was hard. I'm fortunate that I had the time during this drive through Portugal to think through it all, to think through this process and to think, okay, well, who's the best decision? And frankly, actually, I changed my mind over time. And I'm not going to get into that because we're still fairly active in this process. I'm not going to tell you about how things weighed into my decision process, but I will tell you that it's necessary to make a decision. And that was actually the biggest thing that I realized during this process, is that I'm the CEO of the company. I'm the one who's in charge. My name's actually on the company. I can't back away from this. I can't say, oh, well, somebody else can make this decision. Jeff has to make this decision. It's my job to do this. And so, yes, it's difficult to choose one, but it's like that was the whole point of doing this. And so you might get creative with how you make your choices. You might do all kinds of different things, but ultimately, if you're going to put yourself out there to hire somebody, you need to make a decision. And then number 10, the business need is greater than talent. And this is another warning, another thing that I learned over the years, and that is I've talked to many talented people when I didn't have positions open And basically, this is always the conversation. Well, we don't have a job for them, but we really like their skill set. Maybe we should just hire them. And these people are never cheap, right? Maybe we should just hire this person and then figure out what to do for them, or see if they can develop business in this area because they're really talented in this thing, or they're really talented in this particular area. Let me tell you what ends up happening every single time that you hire somebody who has a lot of talent, but you don't have a job for them. They don't get anything done. They don't have the guidance from you because you don't even know what needs to be done. You don't have clients paying for you to do it. There's all these different things where somebody comes into your organization with a competency. Your organization doesn't have that same competency. They're sort of sitting on an island waiting for things to happen, and you're sort of waiting for them to develop things without giving them any accountability, any responsibility, or any ownership of the process. And that doesn't work out. So even if you find people who are super talented, if they don't want to do what you need them to do, you're much better off finding somebody who's, I wouldn't say less talented, but talented differently, and then wants to do the work. You're much better off with that person than trying to force somebody who's talented into a position that they don't want to do. It might work out in the short term to have somebody who's talented do something that they don't want to do, but it's not a long-term building block. It's not a long-term thing that you want to have done. And if it's not long-term, what's going to happen is they're always going to be looking over their shoulder for the next opportunity. They're going to put things in place that are probably not the best way to get things done. And then you're going to have to live with that as an organization. So yes, hiring somebody based on liking their skills is not always the best decision for your company. Probably is never the right decision. So you got to be wary of that, and you got to think of it differently. You can't think of it as losing talent, because there's talent out there, and talent is something that can be acquired, and it's something that can be developed. It's not so much that. It's about you're now keeping the company concentrated on what you want to do. You know what's best for your company, not somebody from the outside. So unless your company is lost or aimless or doesn't really know what it's doing, or is in a major expansion point where you know this is the future, then it's not a loss. It's actually a gain. Addition by subtraction. Think of it that way. Okay, so that's a bit of insight into what I've learned about hiring over the years. In reality, when I follow these steps, I always end up with a group of candidates who are on point, people who I really want to work with. But when I fall for a charm or I forget a step, I'm usually disappointed. Now, hopefully you found this useful, whichever side of the table you're on. And if you have any questions, fire away. This is something that I like to talk about, something I like to answer as well. For show notes, visit Jeffalytics.com/hiring. I look forward to talking to you next week.